they have something that we've lost along the way that I don't think we had to lose. It's like the McDonald's story and anything else. I don't think we had to lose that connection with where our food comes from as we made these advancements. We just weren't necessarily conscious of it.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 260. I have Brian Reisinger. He's a farmer. We're going to talk about some of the issues facing farmers in America right now. This is the first time I've pulled a guest from the Atlas Society, which always has really great podcasts. I need to do that more often because they always have really good shows. So anyway, how are you, Brian?
Hey, good morning, Chris. I'm doing really well. How about yourself?
So you're in Wisconsin, is that right?
So I'm actually in California at the moment because we're here for holidays with family. I go back and forth between the family farm in Wisconsin and a small town in Northern California near my wife's family. So.
Okay, so your farming's in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so my dad is a third generation farmer. My sister and I are fourth generation, and I tell our story and I help out on my days off. They throw me in a tractor and I help out on the business side. But it's my sister who's working to take over the farm for my dad and is there with him each day.
So you have the perspective of watching. What did your grandparents or even your great grandparents tell you about farming? What's changed since they were farmers?
Yeah, the big thing that's changed is technology. Farm work today is still an incredibly challenging life. It's a beautiful life, but it's a life filled with hard work and hardship as well. You're working sun up to sundown. You've got, animals to care for, repairs to do, all that. And, 12-hour days are common even before you're in the fields. And times where you're in the fields for planting or harvesting, the sky is the limit as far as hours are concerned. But back then, a lot of that work was done by hand. And so we heard a lot of stories about doing the work by hand and also some of the additional physical danger that they had back in the day. My grandpa, one of the stories we tell in our book is my grandpa had a brother who was crippled in the fields at the age of 2 under the horses. So they would mainly talk about what their life was like in a day-to-day way. My grandparents didn't do a whole lot of talking about the farm until I got working on writing projects and wanted to talk to them about our heritage. And then I found there was a whole, wellspring of stories to be had. But before that, they really kind of just talked about, here's what this costs, here's what that costs. We used to do this by hand, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is something that is a risk. We had a neighbor who got trampled by some cattle. It's you can't, when you're working with large animals, there is still the risk for injury. The horse goes crazy or the cattle run over you, or those are still very real threats. Unfortunately, it's not unusual. So I know it's not statistically the most statistically the top two are always seem to be lumberjacks and fishermen, but there can still be some dangers involved. So, what, and do you think the technology has probably helped because it does some of the work, right?
Yeah, that's right. And technology has been actually a very large double-edged sword in the history of farming. And as we were exploring the different hidden areas of history that are driving the disappearance of our family farms for the past century, I was amazed by that. Technology has been a huge step forward for mankind from the standpoint of agriculture. We went from about 40%, about half of household incomes going toward food, to about 10%. And, we went from a place where almost everyone was growing their own food to where you could have a small minority of the country growing the food for everyone else. So technology accomplished that. It allowed people to take on more acres and more animals with fewer people breaking their backs to do it.
Could farmers form co-ops to, buy one milking parlor that's shared by 10 farmers? Would that work? Or is it really just, or is that just not practical?
It's a great question. It's hard to do with a facility like a milking parlor because everybody's got their own herd, everybody's got their own land. So then you're talking about either shipping your cattle to that facility each day, which is really hard on the cattle, or you're talking about just keeping your cattle at this facility which then the question is sort of like, well, what are you doing with your land? You're probably growing some crops, but having your cows on your facility is kind of part of the deal usually. So that might be hard logistically, but you're right about asking about
Yeah.
co-ops in general, because co-ops were a big solution, a big private market solution, honestly, for farms for a very long time, and they still are. From the standpoint of one of the other things going on, setting aside technology, one of the other things going on is that the farmer is almost always the little guy in our economic picture. We've got all across our economy great big companies dominating most of our industries. So the food industry, the agriculture industry, those industries are trying to keep up with other industries in the American economy, and our farms are working to keep up with those folks. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the other reasons that farms continue to get bigger. But even in that picture, even the biggest of farms is often the little guy. So most medium and small size farms are really minuscule operators in a very large world. And so co-ops has been part of the solution for a long time. They at one time were fairly politically divisive, but we talk about this when we look at the history of the Great Depression. When my grandparents were surviving the Great Depression, co-ops were beginning to become professionalized organizations where they were getting together and they would say, hey, let's band together and let's all these farms together sell our milk together. We got more market power here. And let's also turn around and sell services back to our farmers. So let's buy seed in bulk. Let's buy fertilizer in bulk and sell it back to our farmers at a lower rate than they could get in the market themselves. So co-ops are definitely part of the solution for sure. But there's limits to everything.
Yeah, definitely limits to everything. It's the whole of, a lot of what I would call superficial technology. I mean, how our tractors really, any better now than they were 70 years ago?
Right, right. It's such a great question, and they are not really all that much better in certain ways, to your point, and then in other ways, they are, depending on how you look at it. What I mean by that is the basic function is very much the same. And really, the only way that they've gotten way demonstrably better is that they've gotten to a point where they can do more and more for bigger and bigger farms. So there's a lot of great tractors manufactured in the United States, and there's a lot of great tradition. But the fundamental function is very similar. And the real advancement, for example, has been in the kind of technology that allows a tractor to have a sophisticated computer, allowing a farmer to calculate across a really, really large field. And that's great if you're a big farmer with a really, really big field. But if you're a medium or small size farmer, it doesn't do a whole lot for you, but it is driving up the cost of tractors, So I think you're right that there's diminishing returns to a degree on how much we're computerizing things, not because there isn't value in it, but because it only goes so far. And it really only caters to certain farmers, which contributes to some of the problem kind of unintentionally.
Yeah, well, and one thing I've heard though, for example, so why doesn't somebody out there say, okay, I'm going to make cheap tractors for small farmers and just sell them to the small farmers? Why hasn't that happened?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the reasons is because this issue of leaving behind so many of our farms has gone so far that there are challenges to that being a market for a manufacturer. Now, that does not mean that it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that nobody's trying to do it. There's Kubota is making a lot of smaller pieces of machinery that
Yeah.
smaller farmers or hobby farmers or folks who got a big yard and a little bit of cash
Yeah.
can afford to buy. So there's some of that going on, and I hope that there's more of it where manufacturers of all kinds serve farmers up and down the market and in all kinds of different places, because we still have nearly 2 million farms in this country. 96% of them are family owned. People are shocked to hear that, but there's still a lot of them out there. The issue is, do we have an economically viable path forward for enough of them for it to be a market for those manufacturers? Now, I actually think that we do. There's changes that we need to make in this country. There's ways we have to get the government out of the way and other things for small, mid-sized farms to be growing profitable ventures in a bigger way again. But they're still there. They're still fighting. They're holding on. And if we can find a way for them to be growing entrepreneurial ventures, for one, it can create opportunity for the farmers. For two, it can create more opportunities for consumers who care more than ever about where their food comes from. But also, it could contribute toward, tractor manufacturers being able to serve down market a little bit. Now it's chicken or egg, right? Because if we had more machinery that was affordable for these smaller farms to innovate more quickly, they maybe have a little bit better leg to stand on in the market. Flip side is, if we solve some of these other issues, policy issues and government issues, that would make it so that the farms could do that and they could be more of a market for those tractors. So there's a lot of chicken or egg scenarios here, not to torture a farm pun, but there's chicken or egg scenarios kind of in every direction here. But it could be a viable thing. I think you're hitting on a really interesting idea.
Yeah, yeah, and Kubota is Kubota, right? Yeah, that's the
Right.
name of the company.
That's
Yeah,
right. Exactly.
and maybe somebody, maybe somebody would get into the tractor business who has a norm. I mean, maybe somebody like Honda would get into the tractor business. I mean, they haven't really been in the tractor business, but they already have the manufacturing know-how to get into it. I mean, that could be, open a door for a because, and I think of Honda because they make so many ATVs,
Yep.
and a tractor is really more like an ATV than a car anyway.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. In terms of the torque and everything,
yeah,
power, right.
but you talked about regulations. What kind of regulations do we have here? I'm sure there's a lot that you'd love to scrap probably.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of debates and discussions we could have around government that deal with regulations, that deal with the way government subsidies work, that deal with decisions, like really big decisions that the federal government has made, mistakes they've made in the middle of economic crises. All of these things have contributed toward our disappearing farms. When we look out at how many farms we've lost over the past century, it's actually been 70% of our farms. It's been 45,000 farms per year on average for a century that we've been losing. And some of that is natural market forces, right? I mean, one farmer's doing better than the other and he's going to buy them up. That's true. There's some of that goes on. And we got to understand that there's going to be some of that reality, right? Especially your listeners understand that. But there's also been government policy decisions. There has been the technological issues we've talked about. And then there have been bungled economic crises in this country that, decade after decade have made the disappearance of our farms far more severe than it would have been in the natural market. And on government, regulations, there are so many of them that are out there that maybe they're intended for one good thing or another. Maybe they're ill-intended, but in any case, they don't really carry out their intended purpose. And what they do is they're even harder on the small and medium-sized farms, because the great big farms, they've got the lobbyists to shape the implementation of those regulations. They got the lobbyists and the lawyers and the accountants and everybody to help them navigate how to deal with this. And they've got the capital to set aside the money to pay for the regulatory burden and then still have money left over. Mid-sized and small farms don't have that. That actually happens, as I'm sure, in industries all across the country. It's the mom and pop shops that are hit the hardest. And that's before you even get into the issue of whether our subsidy programs are functioning properly, and before you get into the issue of elected leaders and bureaucrats alike, making huge catastrophic mistakes that can suddenly kick off a crisis, which is what happened in the 1980s farm crisis.
Yeah, because it seems like every time there's a depression or a recession, farmers are in more pain than just about anybody. It's which is unfortunate but true. I mean, what type of regulations can you point to? And I can certainly point to the various subsidies we have there too.
Yeah, absolutely. So on a regulatory front, there's a really great example of the EPA working to implement a regulation around what's considered a quote navigable water. Navigable water is something where they're going to want to regulate that because it it has big water like a river and that kind of thing. And it was being applied, and farms are in danger of it being applied in a way that applies to your average little creek run through the farm to give water to the cattle. It might be just a spot of where water is naturally running from one part of the farm to the next. It's not even really a creek; it's just a ditch that fills now and then. And so that is a really, really big example of it. But then you get into there's so much compliance as it pertains to how you're treating your land, how you're treating animals, and farmers care more than anybody about their land and their animals. But the amount of expense and steps that you have to go through to justify to the government what you want to grow and how you're going to do it and whether you're doing it right, it goes so far beyond making sure that we're being good stewards of our land. Farmers start out from the position of wanting to be good stewards of the land, and there's room for some regulation, but it's just an incredible entanglement for farmers of all types and all sizes. And like I say, that's before you even get into subsidies and other policy decisions.
Yeah, I agree. That's true. Being stewards of the land, farmers are the ultimate in low time preference because, you want to have a good harvest, but you want your grandchildren to have good harvests too.
Right. That's right. And there's a big debate, and it's a legitimate debate around things like monoculture where, farms are really only farming one crop on the ground and how that's bad and it saps nutrients and all that stuff. And that is bad. That is a real challenge. And there's a certain amount of discussion we ought to have around, the role of government in that issue. But here's the other thing. Farmers who don't, work to rotate their crops and plant cover crops and other things like that, they find that their yields go down over time. And they find that if, even if they don't care about the yields going down because, they got enough acreage, they can stomach it, eventually they completely sap the fertility of their soil. And so, farmers want to make sure, to your point, and this is something that I say to everybody, I try to have friends on the right, left, everywhere in between. And, people on the left who are, particularly people on the left, they're not the only ones who care about the environment. People who care about their environment who are on the left, I say to them, hey, you have a lot in common with the farmers, because the farmers want to have healthy soil. The farmers want to have clean, abundant supplies of water, and these are areas that we can agree on and focus to work together on, as opposed to divisive debates that, put farmers in a position of not being sure if they can afford to continue to make a living.
Yeah, I think you find out that the left really doesn't care, and a lot of these, ideologues, they would never survive a day working on a farm. It's
Yeah.
it's a real workout.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing that I think in general is true, which is that policymakers of all stripes, we don't have enough of them in Congress and elected office who understand what's going on a farm at all on the ground, let alone understand how that is tied to our food supply. And the reality is that concerns out there about the health of our food, concerns out there about the price of our food, and concerns out there about the security of our food supply, all of them are made worse by the way we've been wiping out our farms in this country. And so, but the problem is that we have policymakers that don't understand what's going on in those farms, let alone how it connects to all those issues with our food supply.
Yeah, and it seems like it's been very consolidated and very corporatized. I mean, if you go back 150 years, most people probably never ate food that came from more than 25 miles away.
Right.
And 25 miles away is probably stretching it.
Right. Yeah, it began with many of them growing their own, and then it became where more of them lived in town and fewer were on the farm. But you still had so many farms across every region of the country that, people went into market, right? And they'd go into town, and there would be farmers who take their stuff into market and sell it to food sellers or direct to consumer. And, my great grandfather, who came to America, we tell the story, he escaped pre-World War I Europe and came to America to find a better life. He would go into town and he'd sell his milk, he'd sell his cream, he'd sell his eggs from his chickens, he'd sell bull calves, he'd sometimes he'd sell pigs. Like, he would go in with his wares, and it was a much more diversified form of agriculture. And now today, most farms specialize in one or maybe two crops or products. And most farms are competing in this very large corporatized system where the food that the consumer eats came from, only the good Lord knows how far away and what's it been through,
Yeah, that's true. And I certainly, appreciate things like baked Alaska salmon now and then, which obviously isn't where I live, but yeah, there's definitely that. And you'll still see that elsewhere in the lesser developed countries. You'll see the fisherman go out for the day, and then when the fisherman gets done, he'll stop by the seafood restaurant and say, "Okay, here's my catch of the day. What do you want for it?" And he'll sell it directly to the restaurant.
That's right.
I don't think you see that in America anymore. But from what I hear, farmers can't even really. It's not even that easy for farmers to sell directly to the public anymore.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, here's the situation that most farmers are in, and I think there's a way that we can address it. But the situation that most farmers are in is they are currently serving a limited number of markets that can give them some level of income. So growing commodity corn, growing soybeans, different, growing wheat, there's different types of crops where there's an established market for it. Farmers know if they grow it, there's going to be some level of income. That income is becoming less and less sufficient because you got costs going up, right? Just like consumers are facing cost crunches. You got the price of seed, price of fertilizer, price of energy, everything going up. Meantime, the prices you can get for those commodity crops, they might be going up, they might be going down, but they're never really keeping pace with the increase in expenses. And that's why one of the reasons why more and more farms get wiped out every year. Now, people say, well, why don't the farmer just sell something different? That's a great question. Many farmers would like to, but there isn't necessarily a market for it. Now, that could change. More and more people care about where their food comes from, but by and large, most of the American public doesn't buy their food in a way that ties back all that directly to the farmer. They're buying their food from different places that, food that's been processed by different companies. And the farmer's in that equation somewhere, but the farmer's pretty far back in that equation, right? And so the reality is that you got all these farmers that they grow something else if they could. And you got all these consumers that sometimes question, boy, what have I got for dinner here? Is there a way for me to know more about where my food comes from? Well, we can do something about that. Consumers can take steps toward buying more directly from farmers as they're able, local farmers markets, stop at the local butcher shop, stop off at the fruit stand on the way home from work, ask your grocer, because a lot of grocers are willing to carry local goods if they know that there's a demand for it. All consumers can take steps in that direction. And then farmers need to be taking steps in that direction where, they take a little bit of their acreage and they set aside, some acreage to grow some artisan tomatoes because they know they can sell that to this local food distributor that's got a new market here from people who care about where their produce comes from, and there's room to move in that direction, but we kind of all have to do it. And absent doing that, you got a whole lot of farmers who say, well, geez, I'd love to grow something different, but I don't necessarily see a market for it. I don't know how I can get it to market. You got a lot of farmers, they know exactly where to take commodity corn to the local grain elevator, but they don't have a place to sell artisan tomatoes or specialty wheat necessarily. We can change those things, but we all got to kind of move in that direction together.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it just helps if people are a little more conscious of what they're buying. I can certainly remember, buying corn from a guy who was selling it out of the back of a pickup truck,
Right.
and certainly going to orchards and buying apples.
Yeah.
These are
Yeah.
things you only get during certain times of year. And
Yeah.
I'll admit it. I don't eat apples like I used to, but it was nice to be able to get apples all year round. Even if they came from a long way away, it's like, well, sure, I can still get my apples.
Yeah, that's right. You're so right with that. And like with the catch of the day, you were mentioning things like that. There are glimmers of this. There are ways that we have local and regional and specialty. Those are the three types of food that we need to be do more local food, more regional food, more specialty food, because farmers can also be growing specialty products that go into, the food economy and go all over the country. But it's something that helps create more niches, more niches for farmers and more options for consumers. That's what we're looking to create. And we've got some examples of local here and there, and there's a growing local food movement. It's a good thing. And historically, you're right too that the fruit farms, you go pick your apples. It's kind of an outing for the family. So there's some of that. There's glimmers of that. And I think the issue is, are we all willing to take a few steps in the direction of moving toward a food economy that has more of its actual bulk food that it produces based in that? I think that if each consumer were to take a small step in that direction, I think you'd see that the American free market economy would respond to it as much as it can. And I think you'd see a big change.
There also seems to be, what we hear a lot of talk about, say grass-fed beef, free range chickens versus chickens that are just basically locked up all the time. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that it's a good thing for consumers to be identifying what they want and farmers to respond to it. I think it gets complicated when you get into, all of the different particulars. Here's the reality. Some people really like grass-fed beef, and there are benefits to it. Some people really like grain-fed beef, and they may not realize it, but that steak that you get in the restaurant that's got that really nice marbling and it's a really nice rich steak, that is often a grain-fed animal. And so, I think that it's good for consumers to pursue what they want. I think it's good for farmers to be responding to that and to be growing and producing what it is the consumer wants. And so if the consumer's heading in that direction or heading toward organic or anything else, I think that's a really, really good thing. Chicken and poultry, that's a good example of an industry that, it's one of many all across not only the food and egg economy, but the entire economy that's gotten really consolidated, and so it ends up kind of meaning that, they're raising as many chickens as they possibly can in one particular area. And, when you talk to experts about that, some of them will say there's downsides, someone will say there are upsides. It's a really complicated picture. But the reality is that consumers want to know more and more where their food's coming from. They want to know more and more how the animal is treated. And they want to know more and more that what they're getting is either fresh or is produced by a farmer, an American, farmer, in a way that feeds a specialty food market, whatever the case may be. And I think that farms being, ready to adapt toward what the consumer wants is good. The issue is that we need to have the whole mass of the consumers moving in a particular direction if we want to expect farmers to move in that direction too. If we have a vocal minority, yelling about this preference or that preference, but nobody else is moving their buying behavior in that way, you can't blame the farmer for not moving toward it. So it's all about, do we have real market demand or not?
Well, yeah, that's what I wonder, about real market demand. I mean, for example, with subsidies, I mean, it's pretty much poison either way, but would you rather have your Pepsi or Coke with cane sugar, or would you rather have it with high fructose corn syrup? It's all these subsidies for corn have ultimately, made high fructose corn syrup cheaper than sugar.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the other thing about it is, then you get into subsidies. Now, that's a very interesting debate, especially for people who believe in the market. I'll say that, if I had my druthers, and I think a lot of people feel this way, that, they'd say, boy, it'd be nice if we didn't have to have any subsidies at all. And whether that's a reality we can get to or not is an interesting discussion. Here's the reality that we know. People from the right, people from the left, people outside farming who are critics of it, people from within farming, everybody's got something they hate about our current farm programs if they've spent any time paying attention to it, right? And you can't really blame them. What we have is we've got the federal government has piled program upon program, subsidy after subsidy, one on top of the other for decades now. And we very rarely does Congress go through and actually reform those programs. You just saw this, the farm bill, they didn't pass a new 5-year farm bill that, got into the depths of how the programs are working. They just passed a temporary extension, right? And so we keep on punting down the road. We keep on not doing the serious policy work because of the congressional gridlock, and you keep on piling program over program. Now, you can look at each program and you could debate for it or against it. But when you have program after program piled on top of one another, you don't necessarily know if they're working properly. You don't know if they're contradictory toward one another or not, and often they are. And you don't really know if they've become prone to abuse and favoritism, which we know government is prone to over time. So you have all this problem where you have all this taxpayer money going toward agriculture in America, but very little of it is getting to the places that it is intended to go, accomplishing the things that it is intended to accomplish. So we've got a huge problem with all that. Now, there's probably there's a discussion to be had, a debate to be had amongst, people who believe in the market. There's probably a place to some degree for government providing some level of safety net for farming in the face of things like uncontrollable weather. You have to have some level of stability for the food supply, maybe a little bit of a basic safety net to help deal with uncontrollable factors like weather. But from there, why are we making all of these decisions favoring this industry or that industry or this type of farm or that type of farm? There's so much picking of winners and losers that's going on. And that's happening even if the programs were working, and even if they weren't contradictory, and even if they weren't open to abuse and favoritism. But we know that they are all of those things as well. So we have a really big mess, and we don't necessarily know if it's working the way it ought to. And so you got farmers who don't know that they're getting the assistance that they're supposed to. And you got taxpayers saying, what in the hell is going on here? And everybody's kind of justified.
Yeah, I definitely, I wonder, what would emerge in the market that might, take care of weather emergencies and things like that, and of course, I believe, the whole system of futures and options also helps, that helps the farmer out because it stabilizes the prices, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that has been a really good innovation that has been a good thing. And some farms have been able to take advantage of that. And many of them operate on some level through those. So there's something to be said for those things too. The issue is that we don't really get the chance to figure out where we don't really have the opportunity at the moment. And I hope this could change, but we don't have the opportunity at the moment to say, okay, here's where the market works properly and can yield new innovative solutions. And here's where government is a necessary presence. We don't really have the opportunity to do that. And the reason we don't have the opportunity to do that goes back to the Depression, because when the Depression hit, FDR and the New Deal, they utilized that as an opportunity to engineer a massive intervention of government into agriculture. And ever since that time, we talk about this in the book, ever since that time, whether there are goods or bads, we really have not shifted off of that basic premise. And, there was some bipartisan acceptance over time of things that were at one time believed to be emergency measures. And we've really kind of, you invite government into an industry and it's really pretty hard to unwind. And that's the morass that we're in, at this point, and really ever since for decades now.
Yeah, it's definitely a morass is a good word for it, and it does worry me sometimes too. When you hear what have you seen the movie Food Inc. for example?
I haven't seen it. It's on my list though, and people are telling me I need to watch it. I feel like I really need to.
It just goes it goes really into how the entire restaurant industry corrupted food because before there if you go back 100 years there really wasn't a restaurant industry like there is now. People don't eat at home as like they used to, and I wonder if that's impacting things.
Yeah.
I did not witness this personally, but I had a landlord who told me that his dog would not eat hamburger from McDonald's. And
Yeah.
I'm just asking myself, what does that dog know that we don't?
You know, it's such an interesting thing because, we talk in the book about in the 1950s when my dad was growing up and we were going from my grandparents growing up in 2 decades into poverty during the Depression, climbing the middle class in the 40s and 50s. Around that time in the 50s is when McDonald's came out and really innovated. And it's a story that has so much American ingenuity in it and so much good came of it, but then also so much bad came of it. And I don't think it had to be that way. What I mean by that is they had a really interesting idea. They took the old fashioned hamburger stand and they applied the principles of manufacturing to it, right? They kind of handled the food preparation like an assembly line in there where you had one guy making the patties and one guy or gal, putting the fixings on, that kind of thing. So that was a really great efficiency. And it was so successful that they started launching different franchises across the country. So not only could the McDonald's brothers be successful doing this, but mom and pop locally in Illinois or Iowa could also contract with McDonald's to be able to be a franchisee and open up their own McDonald's hamburger restaurant. Now that was a good thing, and it was an amazing thing. It was an amazing entrepreneurial opportunity. Now, why did it have to mean? Why did it have to mean that we had to move toward mass production of overly processed food to serve those fast food chains? Why couldn't it mean that all those restaurants sprouting up in all corners of the country were patronizing local farms? It could have been a huge source nationwide of the buying and selling of fresh local food. Now, we know one of the reasons it wasn't because they were trying to make the food as affordable and cheap as possible. And it began to get cheaper to ship cheaply produced food
Yeah,
across the country than it did to produce it locally. I get that. I understand that. But it went so far, and the American consumer at that time was less concerned about issues like health and where your food comes from and stuff. Imagine if we'd had that kind of consciousness, because you've seen McDonald's actually move in the direction of environmental sustainability and other things. And whether you agree with what they're doing or
yeah,
not, you can see how they're responding to the consumer. Now, imagine if consumers had said, hey, we like these local hamburger stands. We like how quick it is. We like that it's cheaper than your average hamburger. But where in the hell is this meat coming from? Why does this lettuce look like this? And if we'd
yeah.
had people saying that in the 1950s, I bet you we'd have had McDonald's restaurants saying, hey, we got to start buying from some local farmers here too. We got to make sure that we keep our quality up. Because you see businesses balance cost versus quality all the time, right? And if you go too far in the direction of saving money and not having a quality product, you usually suffer for it. But fast
And
food moved in
yeah,
that direction before we had that consciousness kick in.
and this is a question. Food is not like other products. It's not. I mean, food realistically only lasts 2 or 3 weeks usually, and so is the centralization of the food supply really a good thing, and really does it save money? I have to question because you often have to ship these things in refrigerated trucks. I really wonder if it does save money.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's one of those things where it's a precise calculation, and maybe at one time it did. It's probably diminishing returns, and now we have diminishing returns. Not only from a financial standpoint, but also from a what the consumer wants standpoint. So there's a point where you got to think that there's going to be some sort of a reset. I certainly hope so. But
yeah,
it's a very strong trend that's been in motion for a while. And back when it started, it was probably more economical.
yeah. I wonder, because food is, like I said, food. Food is not toys or paper products. It's not something you can just sit on the shelf for 6 months usually.
Right. Right.
And the food, and I found more. The food that can sit on the shelf that long is often food that you don't really want. It's we haven't, and that's one question, too, is while food has gotten cheaper, is the food as good as it was? I mean, are we paying less money, but getting less nutrition out of that food? Are we
Right.
getting less vitamins? And I wonder, if that's an issue as well, because I think we'll both agree, that overall our grandparents' generation was healthier than we are now.
Right.
And one thing that maybe a tribute to farmers is when do you ever see a fat farmer? Never. You see farmers who can do things in their 60s that a lot of 20-year-olds can't do. I mean, whether it be chin ups or whatever. It's
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
most farmers in the 60s and 70s will kick your ass.
yeah, that's right. There's a story that we tell in the book that really gets at that kind of toughness, and it also gets at the beauty and the hardship of life too. And I think about my dad when I think about the resilience of farm families. And when my dad was 8 years old, my grandpa slipped off a corn crib, fell 30 feet through the air, and broke his back on the frozen ground. And my grandpa ultimately got back up on his feet months later, but he was laid up in the middle of winter. And my dad, at the tender age of 8, was asked to step up on the farm and start doing the work of a grown man. And we tell that story, and it's a story of hardship, but it's also a story of beauty, because he came to grow to love that way of life. It got down into his blood and his bones. And, it's any given moment you can find my dad, and if he's doing what he wants to do, he's probably on the back of a tractor or working with his animals. And so, it's something that really breeds a kind of resilience in people. It breeds an appreciation for the land and what it can give us. It's a good, clean way of living. It's also a hard way of living, but you're right about the resilience that it builds. And I think something in this country that we're losing is, we're not only losing the farms that feed us, but we're losing kind of a part of ourselves, because that value of hard work and that living close to land, that's something that's a very American idea as well.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of people, even in the middle of town, they want to, put in their little garden with tomatoes and stuff. And
Yep.
people do that, and it's rather sad too. Apparently a lot of homeowners associations prohibit that.
Mm.
Because I remember one lady talking, and says, yeah, I go out and plant a little food in my garden, and she says, a lot of my friends can't even have a garden. It's,
Yep.
it's like, why would you discourage people from, and granted, it's just a bunch of tomatoes, but that's something a lot of people do. It's, tomatoes aren't a whole lot of work, and
Right.
yeah, you come to have a different relationship with nature. You also, and people, some of the more vegetarians I know, I said, well, why do they go deer hunting? I says, well, they hunt deer because the deer get into the cornfields. It's
Yep.
because
Yep.
most farmers are hunters as well. I don't know if I know of any vegetarian farmers.
Yeah, I think there are probably some out there, but it's true. You grew up living close to land. I mean, I was raised, not only working with my dad from sun up to sundown, but also, we were raised, hunting small game when we were young, and going on to hunt deer. And, we were taught to respect the land and the animal. You want to respect that natural resource. You want to make sure that if you're harvesting an animal, you do it in an ethical way where there's no suffering. You want to make sure that you're using every part of that animal, and you want to make sure that you're doing all the things you need to do, replenish that natural resource, take care of the land so that you've got a healthy deer herd, so you got squirrels and rabbits each fall, running through the forest, and you want to have that ample resource. So there's a circle of life element to it that I learned really in both farming and hunting growing up.
Yeah, I think there is, and I think maybe it would because we've gotten so far removed. I mean, it's, when you hear people say things like, well, we don't need farmers, we can just buy food at the supermarket. I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, I sometimes maybe it'd be a better America, if every kid, maybe when they're around 10 or 11 spent, one summer on a farm and just saw what happens. And, they'd learn how to work, and they'd certainly learn how to get their hands dirty. But boy, I think just, even though I didn't, sometimes I can just remember going out and picking berries in the middle of the summer, which is always which you can do if you're 8 or 9 years old. It's
right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you try to make sure you don't get stuck. That's why, even though it's a summer, you wear a long sleeve shirt,
Right.
But it can be a lot of work. And I sometimes think, maybe kids would feel better about themselves if they were actually, doing something that was contributing. It's and
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
my dad certainly complained enough though about his childhood. Oh, I had to get up and milk the cows and all this other stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the pendulum's maybe swung a little too far. Not only are we affecting our food supply, we haven't even necessarily talked about how what's happening to our farms affects the price of food, but not only affecting our food supply, not only are we hollowing out rural America and there's an economic crisis that, and not only does it affect all the rest of the country through our food, but there's also something we said for just in general, farms or not, people getting further and further away from rural areas, people getting further and further from outdoor experiences, people getting further and further from a vigorous life where they're able to experience things like that. And I think it's a good thing. I know my little girl, I try to expose her to as much as I can, as many walks of life as I can. And I think having our kids who aren't naturally exposed to a rural walk of life and a walk of life that has to do with farming or the outdoors, it's good for them to experience that, and it breeds vitality and it helps them discover a little bit of who they are too, I think.
Yeah, and maybe they learn not to be afraid of those things. It's
Yeah,
I
exactly.
I wonder, with also what do you say, about other we haven't even gotten to talk much about the FDA, for example. You hear about these Amish farmers being prosecuted for selling raw milk and stuff like that. What do you got to say about that?
Yeah, we need to make sure that we've got a situation where the government has regulations that are reasonable, that allow things to occur in the market where people can buy and sell what they want to be able to buy and sell while being safe. And right now we've got this massive, regime of regulations that supposedly are keeping us safe, and they aren't necessarily doing that. And in the meantime, the government has their boot on the neck of people who are trying to sell a good product. Now, the issue with that specific Amish farmer, it's very interesting because it led to a really big uprising. It led to a lot of really angry, frustrated people who are saying, hey, let this guy do what he's trying to do. Now, the particulars of the case need to be looked at in any instance, but I think we can agree that we've got a whole lot of government that is doing a whole lot of things that aren't necessarily accomplishing what they're setting out to accomplish. And there probably is a place for there to be a market for raw milk in addition to the milk that can be shipped across the country and done more things with. There's probably a world where we can figure out that correct balance, but that's not the world that we live in at the moment, because
Yeah.
we have both sides that deal with kind of big sledgehammers swinging back and forth at each other. And as we discussed with the Farm Bill or anything else, there isn't a whole lot of work being done to roll up our sleeves and figure out how to reform our programs or reform the way the government interacts with the farmer. It's mostly getting punted because we got gridlock and we can't move anything through.
But this again, though, is something where I think, I think farmers, want to maintain goodwill and they understand this is
Yeah.
important. And especially the way, their dad sold us bad milk 20 years ago, so we're not going to buy milk from his kids. I mean, that people have those kinds of attitudes. You make your customers angry once, that sometimes they'll never forgive you. And it's really hard to win that goodwill back. It's
right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. There's a certain amount that's sorted by the market.
But I remember going down to Peru 7 years ago, in the middle of the rainforest, and people down here are poor.
Yeah.
They live in, but it's near the equator, so they don't have to worry about getting cold. But they might live in things, the equivalent log cabins. But I asked myself, do these people eat better than we do in America? I mean, I'm thinking, okay, there's fish in the river. It's a rainforest, so there's fruit everywhere.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, even though these people are poor, sometimes I wonder if they were eating better than we did. And I think they might have been.
Yeah. It's something where they've not necessarily lost the connection between their food and where it comes from. I'm sure there are medicines and different types of advancements that their societies would benefit from further. I'm sure that the poverty, is such a challenge. And there's all kinds of challenges and problems that I'm sure that they'd love to develop through and be able to advance from, as our country did. But at the same time, they have something that we've lost along the way that I don't think we had to lose. It's like the McDonald's story and anything else. I don't think we had to lose that connection with where our food comes from as we made these advancements. We just weren't necessarily conscious of it.
That's the truth. We didn't have to lose it. I mean, we could have kept it. Like that connection. And I went to Iquitos, which is and every weekend there's this market where people come from all over just to sell everything.
Yeah.
In the rainforest. It's just but you'd have your fish. I remember we had some good eggs down there. We had some, because we went into the rainforest for 11 days. We had eggs. We had camu juice, which is a fruit down there. We had these little bananas that are, and it's funny, I felt really good. It's like, I was probably closer to nature than I ever had been with my food. Yeah, it really, it makes me, I draw the line on monkeys. That's just too close to humans. I'm not going to eat monkeys. But yeah, but fish, or because they certainly hunt, they fish. It's so it does make me wonder, where how do you think we get out of this? I mean, I'm all for laissez-faire. You seem like you're mostly for laissez-faire, but obviously you're bringing up some issues that I think are legitimate.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And I would say that, I mean, I think that I have a similar attitude to you. And what I've been doing is spending time immersed in this industry that, whether we like it or not, is all wound up and mixed in with government. And so some of the solutions involve, figuring out the way you can deal with that reality, and I think that a big part of the solution is moving the direction you and I are talking about here, where we can have more ways that the farm can be responding to the market, and that the market can be sending signals to the farm. And there's so many of the things we're talking about that have interfered with that. Right. So I think that capitalism and the free market are a big part of the solution. There's some things that we need to do to enable more of that to function properly. One of them, and I'll talk about it briefly, and we can unpack on them if you want, but one of them is that we need to have an R&D revolution in this country, research and development revolution in this country, whether it is private sector research and development, of which there's a large amount, whether it's government research and development and making sure that that's accountable and focused in the right direction. We don't have enough new innovation coming into American agriculture, and it's not focused on being skill neutral. It's not focused on being something that any and all types of farms can access. If we were to have more research and development restoring, we've got productivity in farming is actually, although it's been a really proud advancement for a long time, it's actually slowing. And America is actually a drag on global innovation right now, which is kind of shocking to think about. So if we could have a research and development revolution that strengthens what we're putting toward new discoveries in agriculture and does it in a way that can allow all farms to access it, that'd be a big part of it. The other thing we need to do is we need to change government policy to make sure that we've got fair markets, both internationally and domestically, where we don't have imbalances that make it so that your average little guy can't compete. It's not a matter of whether they compete in the free market; it's whether they compete against market power and government regulations and massive powers that be out there that have been given unfair advantages. And then we need to be organizing ourselves around market opportunities, and that gets back to a lot of laissez-faire stuff. We can get that innovation going with an R&D revolution if we can fix government policy and make sure that government is functioning the way that it ought to. Then we can have, the big part of this is having more and more people organized around new market opportunities for farmers. You got, in Wisconsin, we had the Master Cheesemaker program that made it so that when Wisconsin was no longer the lead producer of milk because California overtook them, well, Wisconsin said, well, we're going to be the lead producers of specialty cheese. And so you've got all these dairy farms that are supplying to all these cheese factories of different sizes and types all across the state that are all producing different types of specialty cheese that is known across the country as a niche. It's a specialty food. So if we can find more of those specialty food opportunities, we can find more local and regional opportunities, and we can begin to organize ourselves, farmers producing that, consumers wanting to buy it. These are the kinds of things that can really begin to change what we're doing.
How many different kinds of cheese are the cheese people grow?
I
said, how many different kinds of cheese are there?
Yeah, there are so many, and I couldn't name them. And the reason is because it's not only the different types and varietal, but it's the different styles of cheese that are now being produced. So in the local cheese factory right down the road from where I grew up, where my dad sold our milk for years and years and years, Cedar Grove's cheese factory, they not only produce, cheddar and all the different types of cheese that you can imagine, but they also produce things like Brazilian cheese that's really good for tailgating because it melts. It's got a really low point to melt. And so it's great for tailgating because you can quickly produce an appetizer, right there on your grill. And so there's just, it's endless. And it's a perfect example. Another good example, whether people are wine drinkers or not, is wine in California. Think of the infinite numbers of varietals and the
Oh yeah.
farmers that can have entrepreneurial opportunity by growing all those different types of grapes. So there's really an opportunity once we open up an area of our food economy and decide, you know what, we're going to let free market competition in here. We're going to let variety in here. We're going to let the consumer dictate what we're doing in here. There's a lot of opportunity for all kinds of new things that farms can be doing from an entrepreneurial standpoint and consumers can be buying from a food supply standpoint.
Yeah, I know you want to get going pretty soon, but one thing I want to point out before he goes, at least as far as recorded history, at least since 1492, the Western Hemisphere has never had a famine. That is a tribute to capitalism, and that what we've had with capitalism is a tribute to our innovations.
Yeah.
And free markets have gotten rid of famine. And if you go back to something like I don't know if you're aware of 1816. It's called the year without a summer, where for example, they had snow in the state of New York in June and stuff like that. I mean, something like that. But America managed to survive that even without a famine. If you'd had something like that happen 2,000 years ago, you would have had massive deaths.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's, and really the fact that we're richer means we can actually sustain more of these weather downturns that happen. Just curious, what do you think about climate change?
Yeah.
Is there climate change or is it sunspots or is it man-made? Or I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Right. Well, first of all, what you said about the advancement and the prosperity of Western civilization guarding against so many of these challenges is so right. And that's one of the reasons that we need to recognize that we have a food system that is a modern miracle. And that modern miracle needs reform because it has deep vulnerabilities. So it's both true that it's a modern miracle and that it has deep vulnerabilities. And people who want to turn away and not look at the vulnerabilities are really putting themselves in a position where our supply chain is going to continue to lock up. They're going to continue to have scarcity of food. They're going to continue to have higher food prices on top of all the other problems that you and I have been talking about. And people who want to deal with it by blowing up the system don't realize that they're going to wipe out a massive amount of prosperity. They're going to increase the price of food, all kinds of things. So, we need to reform the current system. And I think the point that you made at the beginning of that question was really, really important. From a climate standpoint, farmers experience the fact that the weather and the climate is changing, each day. And I think it's clear that there's changes going on in the atmosphere. And I'm not someone who's qualified to say exactly all the forces driving that, but I do think that you have a lot of farmers who recognize that there's a change going on. And the challenge that they have is not necessarily agreeing with that, but the challenge that they have is that the solution has been so far, government that could make it completely unaffordable for them to be able to continue to make a living. And so you have a lot of people who are resistant to that debate because it's been wiping out their way of life. That's the same thing with coal mining and all kinds of other industries, right? So I actually think that what we should be doing is exploring how can we have private sector innovation help address the degree to which we're producing pollution in this country. And that goes back to the R&D revolution. If we have an ability to innovate our way out of the amount of polluting that we're doing, why wouldn't we take it? But we're really not exploring that. What we're doing is we're having a debate over how much government do we need to have, increasing the regulations and the costs of people who are trying to make a living that, happens to have something to do with the environment. So I think we're just really missing the boat on the opportunity to have a discussion around what private sector innovation could do to deal with the challenges that we're facing weather-wise.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things the private sector, too. And I have to admit, one thing that does scare the crap out of me is lab grown meat. Because I'm afraid also they're going to try to regulate, real meat out of existence. And it worries me that some real food will get regulated. I forgot to ask you too. What do you make, that whole thing, with seeds? You can patent a seed. Now, if that seed's on your land, you have to, you know what I'm talking about? All the GMO seeds are now taking over and the regular seeds are no longer here. And, it's putting out, we never commented on that, unfortunately.
Yeah. The first part of what you said, I think is really important. The idea of lab grown meat. Here's the thing. the people who care about our environment, the people who care about, what they're putting in their bodies should really care also, whether they want to eat meat or not. I respect someone who doesn't want to put something in their body and decide they're a vegetarian. That's their decision. But, people who care about our environment, people who care about where the food comes from really ought to care about making sure that we don't go the route of lab grown meat, because, one of the things that we're losing there is what's natural, what's natural. So when something's growing out of the ground naturally, it's generally good for you. When something's growing out of the ground and that leads to a meat product, it's generally good for you. But when something is grown in a lab, that is going in the direction of the overly processed food that is also a problem in this country. So we need to make sure that like environmental sustainability is maybe part of the solution, but it's not coming at the expense of what's natural, what's fresh. So we should be pursuing what's natural. Often what's natural can also be sustainable. And if we throw out the idea of what's natural, we're going to find ourselves eating all kinds of things, and we're going to be going in the wrong direction where we already don't know what we're putting in our bodies, and lab grown meat is only going to make that worse. Now the issue of seeds and GMO and all that kind of stuff, here's the issue that I think we need to confront. We've been talking about technology, and we've been talking about, what's scale neutral. One of the most amazing opportunities for scale neutral technology is what's known as gene editing. Science can sound scary sometimes. So sometimes people think that sounds like cloning Dolly the sheep, and that kind of thing. What gene editing actually is something where you can carefully edit, the particular genetic makeup of a seed. Think about when we came up with the concept of hybrid corn, right? And we could suddenly grow corn more resiliently, the yields could go up. Gene editing is like that, except for it makes it possible to grow more types of crops in more climates, more times of year. So all these farms that are locked into growing certain types of crops because that's the only market they can find, and all these consumers who wanted to have more opportunities for fresh local food, suddenly it's possible to grow more types of crops in more areas, and it can really open up the opportunity for local and regional foods. That's the kind of discussion and the direction I think we need to be going in. There are certain types of seed technology that right now that are safe and perfectly good. There's certain types that really are kind of twisting things. What we need to be doing is having a wide open debate about that, exploring technologies like gene editing that could be scale neutral for farmers and that could really open up all kinds of opportunity. If we have a open, transparent debate around where we think the lines ought to go, we can have a way to have good, fresh, natural food that comes from safe, natural seed. And we can also really revolutionize the type of crops and foods that are available in this country for farmers to grow and consumers to buy.
Yeah, true. I was just worried, about the concern where, the seeds might blow onto the farmer's property and then he's got to pay royalties to the people who have the patents.
Yeah. I think that that's a little bit ridiculous. I think that, look, you got something going on your land. That's one thing. Yeah. As long as you're not, like if weather or some other natural occurrence is making something happen on one land, piece of land shift to another piece of land, the person whose land has that seed, ought to be making sure that they're doing it the right way. And, the idea of, something blows over and now you got to pay I think that's, that's ridiculous. We got to recognize reality.
Yeah. Well, we can't stop birds from shitting.
That's right.
If you want to give it, if anybody can figure out a way to do it, they'll probably be a trillionaire. But until then, and that's really how this, like, they really don't blow by the wind. That's how they spread. That's how the seeds spread. The birds. Right. But yeah. Anyway, it's been great talking to you, Brian. Where can we find you out there on the net?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my book, Land Rich, Cash Poor, which explores these issues driving the disappearance of our farms and weaves it with our family's 4-generation story. You can find that on Amazon or anywhere your book's online. You can also find it in bookstores nationwide. They'll have it or they can order it for you. In addition to my book, Land Rich, Cash Poor, you can find me on X. I'm at Brian J. Reisinger. That's Brian, Brian, J as in James, Reisinger, Reissinger. And I'm out there on X talking about all kinds of ag issues, sharing more of our story, and just trying to spread the word. So I appreciate anybody who picks up the book, and I appreciate anybody who just keeps these issues and the dialogue around them going.
Yeah, it's important to talk about this. Well, thank you very much, Brian. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out my Substack, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Go to buy me a coffee to support the show. Thank you, Brian. I'm Chris Baker, and we did have some we did have some issues with connectivity here, which is why we killed the video. So hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much, everyone, and we're out.